When Kublai Khan's forces breached the walls of the southern Song capital at Lin'an in 1276, they did not enter as destroyers. They entered as administrators. The imperial palace complex, which had housed the Song court for over a century, remained structurally intact. No fires consumed the lacquered halls. No looting mobs ransacked the treasure rooms. What happened instead was methodical, bureaucratic, and designed to achieve something far more comprehensive than destruction. This is what they actually did. The Mongol conquest of the southern Song dynasty culminated not in a single dramatic siege, but in a calculated surrender. Empress Dowager, governing as regent for the 5-year-old Emperor Gong, negotiated terms with Bayan, Kublai Khan's commanding general. The agreement was specific. The imperial family would be escorted north to Khanbaliq, the Mongol capital. The palace would be transferred intact. Resistance would cease. On March 28, 1276, the formal surrender documents were signed. The southern Song dynasty, which had ruled China south of the Yangtze for 152 years, ceased to exist as a governing entity. Within the palace complex resided approximately 3,000 women. This number included the Empress Dowager, imperial consorts, palace concubines, female attendants, servants, musicians, dancers, and administrative staff who managed the inner palace operations. These women represented a specific problem for Mongol administration. They were not combatants. They were not officials who could be reassigned. They were not merchants who could be taxed. They were inhabitants of an institution that no longer had legal existence. Mongol military doctrine provided clear protocols for handling defeated armies, captured officials, and resistant populations. It provided no equivalent framework for managing 3,000 women whose entire social function had been tied to an eliminated government. The solution was categorical reorganization. Mongol forces did not execute the palace women. They did not distribute them as spoils. They did not leave them in place. They processed them. The processing began with documentation. Mongol administrators, accompanied by Chinese officials who had surrendered earlier, entered the inner palace sections that had been forbidden to men outside the imperial family. They brought registers, ink, and systematic methodology. Every woman was interviewed. Names were recorded, ages were noted, skills were catalogued, family connections were documented, previous roles were classified. This documentation served multiple purposes. It created an official record of imperial palace inhabitants, establishing Mongol authority over what had been the most restricted space in the previous government. It identified women with specific knowledge of court procedures, treasury locations, and administrative systems that the Mongols intended to preserve. It determined which women had family connections that could be leveraged for political purposes. It assessed which women possessed skills applicable to other contexts. The classification process divided the palace women into distinct categories. Imperial family members, including the Empress Dowager and the Emperor's consorts, were designated for transport to Khanbaliq. High-ranking concubines with documented family connections to southern Song officials were marked for political reassignment. Women with administrative skills, literacy, or expertise in areas like medicine, textile production, or music were identified for functional redeployment. Lower-ranking attendants and servants were processed for general redistribution. Each category received different treatment, different destinations, different futures. The Empress Dowager Shi and the young Emperor Gong were transported north under military escort in April 1276. The journey took 3 months. They travelled not as prisoners in chains, but as relocated officials, accompanied by reduced household staffs and guarded by Mongol cavalry units. When they arrived in Khanbaliq, they were not imprisoned. They were installed in designated residences and assigned stipends. The young emperor was given a Mongol title, Duke of Ying, and enrolled in a Buddhist monastery where he would spend the rest of his life studying religious texts, effectively removed from political relevance while remaining alive and documented. The Empress Dowager was permitted to maintain a small household. She could receive approved visitors. She could correspond with family members if those letters were reviewed. She could observe religious practices. She could not return to the south. She could not issue proclamations. She could not organize support for Song restoration. She lived in Khanbaliq for 18 years, dying in 1294 at age 71. Her presence serving as living proof that the Song imperial family had submitted to Mongol authority rather than being annihilated by it. High-ranking concubines from the imperial palace faced a different process. Those with family connections to southern Song officials who had not yet surrendered became negotiating instruments. Mongol administrators sent messages to these officials. Your daughter, your sister, your niece is in our custody, unharmed, and will remain so contingent on your cooperation. This was not a threat of violence. It was a clarification of incentive structure. Mongol policy preferred administrative absorption to military destruction. Officials who surrendered retained positions, properties, and family connections. Officials who resisted lost all three. The strategy was effective. Multiple southern Song officials who had retreated to coastal regions with intentions of continued resistance received word that female family members from the palace were being held in comfortable conditions pending the officials' decisions. Many chose surrender. Their family members were subsequently returned to them, often with Mongol-arranged marriages to Mongol officials or to Chinese officials who had already integrated into the Yuan administration. These marriages were not forced in the traditional sense of immediate coercion. They were structured as optimal available options within a transformed political reality. Women identified as possessing valuable skills were reassigned to functional roles within the emerging Yuan dynasty administration. The Mongols, despite their military dominance, lacked expertise in Chinese administrative systems, textile production, ceremonial protocols, and cultural practices necessary for governing a Chinese population. Palace women who had managed imperial silk workshops were transferred to Yuan-controlled production facilities where they supervised continued operations under new ownership. Women who had served as palace physicians were assigned to newly established medical bureaus. Women trained in music and dance were incorporated into Yuan court entertainment structures. This reassignment was not presented as opportunity. It was presented as continuation of function under new authority. A woman who had managed silk production for the Song court would continue managing silk production, but now the silk would bear Yuan dynasty markings, and the profits would flow to Mongol administrators. Her expertise remained valuable. Her autonomy did not. Lower-ranking palace attendants and servants who possessed no specialized skills or political connections faced the most ambiguous outcome. Mongol records from this period indicate that thousands of these women were distributed to Mongol military officers, Mongol administrative officials, and allied Chinese administrators who had facilitated the conquest. The distribution followed military rank and administrative position. Higher-ranking recipients received more women. The women were not classified as slaves in the technical sense of Mongol law, which had specific definitions for slave status. They were classified as household members assigned to service. This distinction was legally significant but practically limited. They could not be bought or sold as property. They could not be killed without legal consequence. They had theoretical right to appeal mistreatment to Mongol authorities, but they could not refuse assignment. They could not choose their destinations. They could not return to their families unless the household head permitted it. They existed in a category between slavery and employment, where labor was mandatory, but certain protections theoretically applied. The physical removal of women from the palace occurred in stages over several months. Imperial family members departed first, accompanied by military escort and official documentation of their transport. High-ranking concubines with political value were processed next, moved to temporary holding facilities where their eventual assignments were determined through administrative meetings between Mongol officials and surrendered Chinese bureaucrats. Women with specialized skills were interviewed by administrators from relevant bureaus, then reassigned based on determined need. The remaining population was distributed according to lists that matched women to recipients based on rank-appropriate allocations. By the end of 1276, the palace complex at Lin'an had been emptied of its female inhabitants. The buildings remained intact. The gardens continued to be maintained. But the institution they had housed no longer existed. The structures were repurposed for Yuan Dynasty administrative offices, halls where Song emperors had conducted ceremonies became offices where Mongol officials processed tax records. Courtyards where concubines had practiced poetry became storage areas for military supplies. The physical space persisted, while its social function was completely replaced. The reassignment of palace women served multiple strategic purposes for Mongol administration. It demonstrated Mongol capacity for restraint, countering the reputation for total destruction that Mongol armies had cultivated during earlier conquests in Central Asia and Persia. It provided skilled labor for Yuan dynasty institutions that required Chinese cultural expertise. It created leverage over southern Song officials, whose family members had been palace inhabitants. It distributed rewards to military officers and administrators who had facilitated the conquest. It dissolved the institutional center of Song Dynasty legitimacy by physically dispersing the people who had populated it. But the reassignment also created complications. Chinese cultural norms regarding palace women were specific and rigid. Women who had served in the imperial palace, particularly those who had been imperial concubines, held status that could not be simply transferred to new contexts. They had been forbidden to men outside the imperial family. They had lived in seclusion, regulated by elaborate protocol. Their presence in Mongol or Yuan official households created social ambiguities that Chinese cultural frameworks struggled to accommodate. Mongol administrators were aware of these complications and largely indifferent to them. Mongol society operated under different gender protocols. Mongol women managed households, conducted business, and participated in political decisions in ways that Chinese Confucian norms did not permit. Mongol men married multiple women without the elaborate hierarchical structures that characterized Chinese imperial polygamy. From the Mongol administrative perspective, palace women were simply educated Chinese women being reassigned to new household positions. The cultural meanings those women had carried in Song society were Song problems, irrelevant in Yuan contexts. This cultural disconnect created situations documented in Chinese sources from the period. Former palace concubines assigned to Mongol households found themselves managing properties, conducting market transactions, and interacting with male visitors in ways that would have been absolutely forbidden in the Song palace. Some sources describe this as humiliation. Others describe it as unexpected autonomy. The actual experiences likely varied considerably depending on specific household circumstances, individual personality, and the particular Mongol or Yuan official to whom a woman had been assigned. Chinese literati, who survived the conquest and lived under Yuan rule, wrote extensively about the fate of palace women, often framing their reassignment as cultural catastrophe and symbol of Song Dynasty humiliation. These accounts emphasize the tragedy of imperial concubines, who had been trained for imperial service, reduced to menial household labor. They describe former palace ladies grinding grain, carrying water, and performing tasks that violated their cultivated status. These narratives served specific purposes for their authors, expressing resistance to Mongol rule through coded laments about displaced women, while avoiding direct political criticism that would attract Yuan censorship. But these literati accounts also reveal information their authors did not intend to convey. They confirm that former palace women remained alive, integrated into Yuan society, and visible enough that their presence generated ongoing commentary. They indicate that some former palace women married, had children, and established new family connections under Yuan rule. They document that certain former palace ladies became influential within Yuan households, managing significant resources and exercising authority over other household members. The accounts intend to communicate loss and humiliation, but they inadvertently document survival and adaptation. Some palace women actively resisted reassignment. Historical records mention instances of suicide during the initial Mongol occupation and during the subsequent transport and distribution processes. The numbers are contested, with Chinese sources claiming widespread suicide as proof of virtuous resistance, and Mongol sources mentioning isolated incidents. The actual scale is impossible to determine from surviving documentation. What is clear is that suicide was one of the few autonomous actions available within a system designed to eliminate autonomous action, and some women chose it. Others attempted escape. Yuan dynasty legal records from the late 1270s include cases of former palace women who fled assigned households and attempted to return to family members in southern regions. These cases reveal the legal framework governing their status. Escaped women who were recaptured were not executed. They were returned to their assigned households and the household heads were authorized to impose disciplinary restrictions, but the women retained legal standing to appeal mistreatment, and some cases resulted in reassignment to different households if abuse was documented. The legal system recognized them as subjects with limited rights, not as property without standing. The experience of palace women varied enormously based on factors beyond their control. A high-ranking concubine with family connections to an important official who negotiated favorable surrender terms might be returned to her family and arranged in marriage to a wealthy Chinese merchant operating under Yuan administration, maintaining relative comfort and social status. A mid-level attendant with specialized medical knowledge might be assigned to a Yuan medical bureau, working alongside other practitioners in a professional context. A lower-ranking servant with no documented skills or connections might be distributed to a mid-level Mongol military officer's household in a remote garrison, spending the rest of her life in circumstances bearing no resemblance to her palace training. The Mongol conquest transformed not just the political structure of China, but the social fabric that had been built around that political structure. The imperial palace had been the ceremonial and symbolic center of Song Dynasty legitimacy. Its elaborate protocols, its hierarchical organization, its carefully maintained seclusion had all served to project imperial authority as something sacred, separate, and inviolable. The Mongol reassignment of palace women systematically dismantled that projection. The sacred became administrative, the separate became integrated, the inviolable became redistributed. Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, 5 years before the southern Song capital fell, but the conquest of the south and the absorption of Song institutions was a process that continued throughout the 1270s. The treatment of palace women was one component of a larger strategy of institutional absorption. The Mongols did not destroy Chinese government systems, they took them over. They did not eliminate Chinese cultural practices, they regulated them. They did not annihilate Chinese educated classes. They employed them under new terms. This strategy required demonstrating that Mongol authority extended even into spaces that Chinese culture had defined as most protected and most restricted. The imperial palace interior, forbidden to all men except the emperor, represented the ultimate protected space. By documenting, categorizing, and redistributing every woman within that space, Mongol administration proved that no Chinese institution existed beyond Yuan reach. The message was clear. If the emperor's concubines could be reassigned, then nothing remained beyond Mongol administrative capacity. Former palace women living under Yuan rule carried complicated identities. They had been trained for roles that no longer existed. They possessed cultural knowledge and refined skills that had been cultivated for imperial service. They had lost the institutional context that gave those skills meaning. Some adapted by applying their abilities in new contexts, becoming influential household managers, successful merchants, or respected teachers. Others lived in permanent displacement, maintaining Song Dynasty customs and training in Yuan dynasty households, preserving cultural practices while inhabiting fundamentally transformed circumstances. Their children, born under Yuan rule, inherited fragmented legacies. A child born to a former imperial concubine and a Mongol official existed in multiple cultural frameworks simultaneously. The child might be educated in Chinese classics by a mother who had been palace-trained. The child might learn Mongol military skills from a father who had participated in the conquest. The child might grow up speaking multiple languages, navigating multiple cultural systems, and identifying fully with neither. These children became part of the mechanism through which Mongol rule integrated Chinese society. By the 1280s, the administrative processing of former Song Palace women was complete. Those who survived had been integrated into Yuan society in various capacities. The institutional memory of the Song Palace lived on in scattered fragments, maintained by women who taught their daughters palace protocols that no longer applied to any actual palace, skills that no longer served any practical purpose, but that preserved cultural continuity through transmission. The Mongol treatment of Chinese imperial concubines after conquest was not defined by massacre or mass sexual violence. It was defined by systematic administrative reassignment designed to eliminate the institutional legitimacy those women had represented while preserving their functional utility and political leverage value. The process was methodical, documented, and effective. It achieved the dissolution of Song Dynasty symbolic authority while providing the Yuan dynasty with skilled labor, political instruments, and demonstrable proof of total administrative control. 3,000 women entered Mongol custody when Lin'an fell. Most survived, most were reassigned, most adapted to circumstances they had not chosen and could not control. Their individual experiences varied enormously, but collectively they illustrated a principle of conquest that Mongol administration had perfected. Power is demonstrated not through destruction, but through the capacity to reorganize existence on fundamentally new terms. The women who had served the Song emperors lived on, but they lived in a world where Song emperors no longer existed, where palace protocols no longer governed, where the entire framework of meaning that had defined their lives had been archived and replaced. History does not always destroy what it conquers. Sometimes it simply reassigns it to new purposes, preserving the form while replacing the content, maintaining the presence while eliminating the power. The Chinese imperial concubines survived the Mongol conquest, but the institution they had embodied did not. And that distinction was precisely what Mongol administration had designed